Good morning, readers. Well, today is release day for His Fear Was Real, book number 16 in the Zachary Goldman Mysteries series. That is my private investigator series. And I guess I'm going to jump right into it here and give you a short reading from His Fear Was Real. Rather than starting with chapter one, I'm going to actually start partway through chapter two. So Zachary is having a conversation with his brother Tyrrell, who has been experiencing some difficulties, and Zachary has been worried that he might be drinking again or something like that. And so Tyrrell is about to explain what his issue is. Was Tyrrell lying awake at night, worrying about Zachary? Zachary knew that the abduction had bothered Kenzie. Even though she had said that it helped her to face what had happened to her, there'd been an increase in her nightmares. Maybe that just meant she was dealing with her own trauma instead of suppressing it. Maybe it was a good sign, but Zachary worried about her, and now about Tyrrell. Is that what's bothering you? He asked. It all got resolved, and I'm okay. It was just one of those freak things. Yeah, I know. Not sure I like it, but I didn't know you'd even been kidnapped until it was all over. So, Tyrrell grimaced and raised his shoulders an inch. Okay, that's just my big brother's life, being the hard-boiled detective. Zachary laughed. He was anything but. He was nothing like the private investigators in the TV shows and books featuring gun-toting, hair-trigger, hard-fighting, womanizing, but ruggedly handsome private eyes. He didn't even own a gun. So he invited Tyrrell to fill him in on what his case with Jennifer, an old school friend, had to do with Tyrrell's distraction. What was it like, meeting her again? A friend from way back then? Yeah, it was nice. Zachary wasn't sure what Tyrrell was looking for. In actuality, meeting Jennifer had been hard. As nice as she was, and as good a friend as she had been back then, she'd brought back memories of a difficult time in his life, a time when he'd lived in a group home. He'd been off of all of the meds he needed to function, dealing with bullying and all of the crap that teenagers had to deal with at school, and abusers within the walls of the home. Jennifer had been a bright light in his life, but it had been a very dark time. Tyrrell was studying Zachary closely, trying to read all of this. Zachary decided he needed to be more truthful if he hoped to get honesty from Tyrrell. She was nice to me then, helped me out at school. She was the only real friend I had for the time she was around. But it was a tough time, and she came to me at the hardest time in her life, after losing her teenage daughter suddenly, so it wasn't exactly a happy reunion for her either. You must have had other friends. The way that I got moved around, and with the stuff I was going through, no, not really. It was a struggle to get out of bed every morning and get to school. I slept through lessons, couldn't concentrate on the work when I was awake, was hypervigilant. Even if some guy had wanted to be friends with me, I probably would have frozen him out, figuring he was just out to gaslight me. Tyrrell nodded. Maybe he'd experienced some level of the same thing. He'd been luckier than Zachary. One of the younger children in the family, he'd been through less abuse and had been removed from an unsafe environment earlier in life than Zachary had. He'd been able to stay with Vince and Mindy, the two youngest children, and all three had been adopted together. But he had still had to go through that trauma, and obviously still had the ADHD genes that Zachary did, and their father's addiction issues. He'd dealt with his troubles in his own way. With Jennifer, she was in the same group home as I was, so we had contact that way, and she was willing to help me with my schoolwork at home at night, and stood up for me at school, so I let her in. It must have been good to see her again after all that time, Zachary said, especially if she was your best friend. Zachary tried to think of a way to encourage Tyrrell without actually lying and saying that he had enjoyed meeting with Jennifer again. It had been a long time, he said finally, and looked at Tyrrell expectantly. It was Tyrrell's turn to contribute and explain his thoughts, what had been on his mind so much that it was distracting his sleep and work. Maybe if it could be addressed, Tyrrell would be able to move forward rather than falling back on the behavior that had worked before, turning to the bottle. I had a friend in school, Tyrrell said, staring past Zachary. Zachary didn't think he was watching the TV this time. but replaying his memories, searching for something. Who? What were they like? Robbie, Robert Elder. He was great. Like with your friend, he was the only one I felt like understood me. Everyone we went to school with, even Vince and Mindy, they were normal, you know? White, middle class, middle income folks who had grown up in the neighborhood, lived with one or two of their parents, were going to graduate high school and go on to college and something better in life, like being a doctor. And they would pay their parents back for all the school bills and everything. Mindy had told Zachary that Tyrrell had insisted on paying his own way in college, so that there would be enough money for the younger kids to go to school. Zachary was proud of him for that. He'd looked after his younger siblings the best he could, even though he hadn't been in a situation where he had to. And things had been rocky for Tyrrell. It was an accomplishment that he had gone on to college and graduated with a degree, let alone paid for it himself. But Robbie was different. Yeah, he was. I didn't know his situation, but I think he was in foster care, or maybe an aunt had offered to look after him. I knew the people he lived with weren't his parents, and they had a lot of strict rules that seemed pretty unfair to me at the time. I should know more, but I was a teenager, pretty self-centered. I never asked him all of the details of how he'd gotten there. We must have talked about the family he'd come from because I knew it had been a pretty volatile home. Zachary understood, like ours. Zachary Tyrrell nodded. So we had that in common. This other life we'd lived, the fact that we weren't living with our biological parents. He understood that not everyone lived in this middle class situation where everything was. Tyrrell shook his head slightly, trying to find the words clean and pressed. That there was an ugly world out there, and we were going to have to face it again someday, by ourselves. Zachary picked at his food, nodding, waiting for Tyrrell to get to the point. What did any of this have to do with today? With slipping up at work, with not being able to sleep at night? We hung out together, Tyrrell said. We're troublemakers. I'm sure people wish they could get rid of us, that we would drop out of school and do our own thing without bothering anyone else. The principal would lecture us. Tyrrell rolled his eyes and stared up at the ceiling, remembering how the younger students looked up to us, especially Vince and Mindy, that they would copy our bad behavior. He didn't even try telling us how we were going to ruin our own futures. I'm sure he didn't think we had any. Well, you showed him. I guess I did. Tyrrell wasn't smiling about it. He looked much like Zachary had felt discussing things with Jennifer, pulled into a dark vortex of unhappy memories. He sounded alone and isolated. So, like Jennifer, Robbie had gone on to bigger and better things. He'd left Tyrrell behind to his own devices. Whether it was his own choice or something he had no control over, Tyrrell had felt abandoned. What happened to him? Tyrrell looked Zachary in the eye, then away again. What do you mean? What happened to him? Well, where did he end up? The two of you lost track of each other? Yeah. Do you think you could find him? I've been thinking, since you had that case, about what it would be like to see him again, catch up on the bad old days. I could look for him, sure, Zachary agreed, relieved that Tyrrell had finally gotten to the point and suggested something he could do. It probably wouldn't be too hard to find someone you went to school with. There are name changes and all that, but most people don't do that. Even if they do, it's public record. Tyrrell chewed on his lip. You would do that? And you think you could find someone after this long? It's been decades. I do have some experience in tracing people. And you solved Heather's case. Tyrrell referred to their older sister. She'd been assaulted years before, and Zach had been able, mostly through luck, to figure out who had done it and to get him charged. Heather could finally open up and live her life again without worrying that her rapist was still out there somewhere, stalking her or her children. The world had become a livable place again, and Heather had blossomed. Well, I did, Zachary admitted. He didn't want to take all the credit for solving the case. Heather had provided parts of the solution herself. It had been a joint effort. And Tyrrell wasn't asking him to solve a cold case, just to trace someone he'd lost track of over the years. High school grad committees track down alumni. It didn't take a lot of skills. If I hired you, you could try to find out what happened to him, Tyrrell pressed. You don't have to hire me. I'll do it as a favor. No, I should pay you. You and Kenzie are already doing so much for me. I should stand on my own 2 feet and cover the costs myself. I mean, it isn't something I have to do. It's just something I want to do, a discretionary expense. Let me see how long it takes, Zachary said, putting him off. It will probably amount to nothing. Tyrrell shifted in his seat and looked around. Okay, I suppose, he agreed. Rather than seeming reassured by Zachary's agreement, he seemed more agitated. He fingered his soft drink glass, no longer wishing he could order something stronger. No doubt, wishing he could order something stronger to take the edge off. "Why don't you give me the details?" Zachary suggested. "All of the vitals that you can remember. Name, birth date, where he lived, his foster parents' names if you knew them, all that kind of thing." "Robbie Elder. I don't know if he had a middle name. We never shared them." Terrell tentatively remembered the street Robbie had lived on, and of course the school they had gone to. Zachary would check with the alumni committee. They might already know where Robbie was. "And do you know what years he lived in the house?" "Months," Terrell corrected. "He wasn't there the whole school year. I think he'd been there from September and then disappeared in March, maybe April." Zachary looked at him. "Disappeared? I thought he was moved to a new family." "I don't know. One day he was there and then he was gone. Not there anymore. Not in any of my classes. When I went to his house to find out what had happened, he wasn't there." "And they told you he'd been transferred to a new family?" Terrell shook his head. "No." All right, so that is a quick peek at His Fear Was Real, and you can pick it up today in my e-store or in any of the major online retailers. And you can also pick up the first book in the series, She Wore Mourning, as a free download on my website or e-store. And if you are trying to get caught up on the rest of the books in the series, then you can get one of the omnibus ebooks that has several of the books together. You can pick up numbers 1 through 13 in one copy for a steep discount. So check out the links in my blog post today, and you'll be able to get all of the previous books in this series as well. Of course, you can read His Fear Was Real as a standalone mystery. You can always read the books individually, but if you want the full experience and want to pick up some of the other books in this series, you can do that. It also crosses over with the Kenzie Kirsch Medical Thriller series. You can find all of those books on my website and e-store as well. And keep an eye on my social media for various Christmas specials. I've still got a couple of things to come out, and you can pick up my Christmas bundle in my e-store. Pick up several different Christmas books and a recipe and all kinds of stuff together there. So check that out as well. All right, talk to you again. Thanks for coming by.